In this video, we're going to create a space shooter game just like this one in 20 minutes using the Godot game engine. So without further ado, let's get into it. Pew, 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 pew. I created an empty project and now I'm going to start my timer to start this challenge. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my project settings and set my window dimensions to 540 to 960. It's gonna be 16 by 9 but reversed because this is going to be like a mobile game instead of a desktop game. I'm gonna set my orientation to portrait and my stretch mode to 2D and my aspect to keep so that it looks the same in different sizes. Now let's create the main scene, which is going to be called world. This is going to be the scene that all the action takes place. I'm going to set this as the main scene, and as you can see, my dimensions are just like a mobile game. Now let's import some assets. I'm going to create a new folder called assets, and I'm gonna drag all of these assets, maybe not this one and this one and this one, into my folder. Great, they're all here. Let's create the background. It's going to be a sprite called BG. I'm going to use this image, but if I resize this, it's scaling and I don't want that, so I'm going to go into the import settings and turn on repeat. Let's turn it on, let's bring it in, and let's turn off centered, and let's turn on region so that I can specify a width and a height, and it's tiling and not scaling. That's what I want. Great. Now I'm gonna create the player character. This is gonna be an area 2D. It's called player. Let's actually turn this into its own scene. Create a folder called characters. Another one called player. Let's save it here. And this is gonna have sprites and collision shape. Let's actually have a collision polygon instead of a shape. I'm gonna use this image right here, but if you look at it inside of the world here, it's a bit too large. And that's why I'm gonna scale the sprite down to about 0.75. Let's define the collision shape. I'm not gonna try and be perfect, I just want to be in the ballpark. Okay, great. Now let's add a script and make this guy move. I'm gonna define a speed variable. This is going to be an integer, let's say 300. And inside of the physics process, I'm gonna use the speed variable, and I'm also gonna define an input vector, which I'm gonna use to define which direction my player is currently trying to move at. Let's create some input actions. Move right, move left, move up, move down, and let's also define one for shooting. These are going to be WASD, D for right, A for left, W for up, down for S. Shoot is going to be space. Okay, now, like I said, I'm going to use this input vector in order to define which direction the player is moving at. So let's say input vector dot x equals input dot get action strength, move right. Let's subtract. Same thing but left. Okay. This is going to be for horizontal movement. Let's do the same for vertical, but change these parameters. Okay, great. Now I have the direction, and now I'm going to use it to increment my global position. Let's say global position plus equals input vector times speed times delta. If I did everything right, this should allow me to move my player. Yep, it's working, great. Now let's implement the simple enemy. I'm only gonna have a single enemy in this game because I don't want to take too long creating different kinds of enemies. This is also gonna be an area 2D. Let's call it enemy, save it, characters, get a new folder called enemy. And it's gonna be much like the player. It's gonna have a sprite. Let's just use a regular old collision shape for this one. We don't really care that much. I'm gonna use this enemy black sprite, and I'm also gonna scale this down to about 0.7. Let's create a new collision shape. Let's make this guy circle. It's not gonna be perfect, but it works. Let's add a script to this. And the only thing we want this guy to do is move down. So I'm gonna define the speed. Let's actually export this. Let's say 150. And inside of the physics process, I'm gonna say global position dot y plus equals speed times delta. Multiplied by delta so that it stays the same on different devices, on different frame rates. And this should work right now. As you can see, it's moving down. And now I have a player and I have an enemy that I can spawn that's gonna go down. So now I need to spawn that enemy. That's gonna be the job of the enemy spawner. So let's create a new scene. This is gonna be a 2D scene. Let's call it enemy spawner. Let's save this inside of the enemies folder. Let's add a script to this. This is gonna have 5 different positions that we're gonna use to spawn an enemy randomly. So let's create another node 2D. Let's call this spawn positions at the end, and let's add 5 position 2Ds. Let's call these spawn position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first one is gonna be at, so our width is 540. We're gonna have 5 different ones. And I'm gonna make these guys start at, I think 70 was the number I wanted. So let's see. First one, 70. The next one, 170. Third one, 200. Fourth one, 370. And the last one is gonna be 470. Okay, yeah, that looks good. That looks about right. And finally, I'm gonna add a timer to this class and call this spawn timer. This is gonna define how far between enemies get spawned. It's gonna be a second by default. Let's say 2 seconds. Actually, 1.5 seconds seems right. We're gonna make this auto start, and we're gonna go back to our script. Let's define a variable called spawn positions. It's gonna be null by default, and inside of the ready method, we're gonna get the spawn positions from the spawn positions node using the get children method. And now we need to make this class spawn a random enemy. So let's actually get the enemy packed scene. It's called enemy. It's preloaded. Should be here. Okay, and now let's create a function called spawn enemy. It's gonna be war enemy equals enemy.instance. Let's add it as a child. And we also need to set its position. So that's why we created all these spawn positions. We're gonna get a random spawn position and we're gonna assign the enemy's position to that. Let's check our time. 10 minutes left. Okay. So at ready, let's randomize so that we get a different one, different random number each time. And before we create the enemy, let's get a random index. I'm gonna do that by using the random I method. Modulo the size of the spawn positions array. Positions. Okay. Now after we add the enemy, actually before, let's set its global position to spawn positions index dot global position. Positions. Okay. If I can stop making that mistake. And now let's connect the timeout method of the spawn timer. And each time the timer times out, let's call spawn enemy. And this should be good to go. Let's test it. So each time the timer goes off, an enemy is spawned at a random position. Let's see if it's random by testing it again. Looks random enough to me. Let's add this class to the world scene. Let's bring it back. And now we should have almost a playable game. We have the player moving around. We have the enemy spawning. Now let's implement the collisions between the player and the enemies and shooting lasers. Okay, so the player, let's quickly define some physics layers. First one is going to be environment, player, and enemies. And let's also say player laser and enemy laser. Great. Now let's put the player on the player layer. And it's going to look for the environment, the enemies, and the enemy laser. And the enemy should be on the enemies layer. And it's going to look for environment, player, and player laser. Okay, we added enemy laser, but enemies aren't going to have lasers, so that was kind of like a habitual thing I did, but they're not going to have lasers. Okay, now let's, inside of the player, let's create a method called take damage. And let's also define a variable for the HP. Let's set it to 3. So the same for the enemy. HP, let's set it to 1. Take damage, damage. Let's say HP minus equals damage, and if HP is less than or equal to 0, let's free this enemy so that it dies. So the same for the player. And now let's connect the area entered signal of the player, and let's say if area is in group enemies, let's take damage. Let's actually not take damage. Let's say area.take damage 1, so that when we collide with an enemy, it dies. And let's do the same for the enemy. When the enemy collides with let's see, when the enemy collides with an area, and if that area is player, let's say area.take damage only 1. Okay, let's add this class name keyword here so that our code inside of the enemy works. Let's also put the enemy inside of the enemies group so that the code inside the player works. Now these two should be able to collide, and the enemy will die when it touches the player, and the player will also die when it touches 3 enemies. Okay, now let's implement the shooting. I'm gonna create a new class. This is also gonna be an area 2D. It's gonna be called player laser. Let's save it inside of a new folder called projectiles. This is gonna have a sprite and a collision shape 2D. Okay, let's set its sprite to the player laser sprite that we have here, and let's set its collision shape to a new capsule shape. Let's put this guy on the player laser layer, and it's going to look for the environment and the enemies. Let's add a script, and let's connect its area entered signal. And this is gonna check if area is in group enemies. Let's make the area take some damage. We could actually check if, like, we could actually do some defensive programming and check if the area has a method called take damage, but I'm not gonna do that because I'm running out of time. Let's make the area take a single damage. Okay, now we need to make the player shoot this thing for it to actually work. Let's create a position 2D. Let's call it muzzle. This is gonna be the point the laser gets instantiated on. Let's bring it about here. Let's get a reference to it inside of our script. Let's create a new function, call it shoot laser. Let's add some scripts, signals, I should say. Signal spawn laser location. And when we try to shoot a laser, we're gonna emit a signal called spawn laser, and we're gonna pass the position of the muzzle. And we're actually gonna spawn the laser inside of the world script. Let's get the laser scene. And let's actually connect the player's spawn laser method. 3 minutes left to here, and let's spawn a new laser whenever this signal is emitted. Let's add it as a child, and let's set its position to location. So now inside of the player script, we can add a new input statement saying if input is action just pressed, shoot, we can say shoot laser. Let's try this. Oops, what's going on? We spawned another player for some reason. Okay, let me check. Did I make a mistake? Yes, I actually loaded the player scene instead of the player laser. Should be inside of the projectiles folder. Okay, that was funny. Okay, I'm still making a mistake. Let's delete this characters there. Okay, we're trying to save. Okay. Now it's working, but the laser isn't moving. Duh, I should have seen that coming actually. Okay, let's actually make the laser move now. So you need to define the speed. Let's say 1000. Laser should be fast. And let's, inside of the physics process, let's say global position dot y equals negative speed plus equals negative speed times delta. Okay, this should make it move. Is that okay? And now we can actually kill enemies. Let's actually make the laser disappear when it enters an enemy. And finally, if I can make it in time, I want to add some score. Let's add a label. Let's say score. Okay, I don't know if I'm gonna have enough time. Let's say score equals 999. Add a variable up here. Call it score. 0 by default. And whenever an enemy dies, let's make it emit a signal. Okay, this is actually going to be tough because my enemies are being spawned inside the enemy spawner. If I wanted to add a score, I would have to connect the enemy's signal here. Oh boy, I'm not going to make it in time. But let's just do it anyway. We're going to be a little bit above 20 minutes, but I think it's fine. Let's add a line here saying enemy.connect enemy died to self. Can I actually do get free current scene score? Okay, let's see if this is gonna work. I'm trying to connect to a method inside of the world script. Let's create a method called score. Let's say score plus equals 10. and let's say score.text. Wait, text should be text. Oh wait, I made a typo there. Okay, score.text equals, oops, the time's up, but like I said, we're gonna be over just a little bit. Let's say score plus string score. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, at first it's gonna be 999, but if I score, great, it doesn't change, it didn't work. Let's see why. Let's take a look at the enemy spawner.
Turn score. Okay, let's actually say. Wait. Is it being called? It's not. Okay, let's see why.
So the new signal here called add score, and this should work now, and we need to, inside of the world script, we need to connect this signal. It's connected to the score function that we created, and now let's also set the score to 0 at the start, 999. Now hopefully this is going to work. Still doesn't work, it's making me angry. Let's see why. Okay.
So score plus equals 10, score.text. Is this being called? It's not being called. That means you're not emitting the signal at the right time. So look here.
Oh man, I'm so angry right now because I didn't emit the enemy died signal inside of here, which is a dire mistake. The first solution we had should have worked if I did this correctly. Let's see. Let's emit this, and now this should work properly. Okay, it's working. We have a game that we can play. It took us a little bit over 20 minutes, but I think that's fine. It's not the prettiest game, but it works. And this is gonna be it for this video. If you liked it, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you wanna give me some feedback. If you want to support me, you can buy my course on Godot. And also make sure to join my email list if you want to get notified of my future endeavors. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.